Welcome to the Free Library of Philadelphia Online. My name is Jason Freeman, and I'm pleased to be here to introduce today's guest, Tessa Hadley. Tessa Hadley is the author of what the San Francisco Chronicle calls strange, unsettling, eerily beautiful, discomforting, stay-up-late addictive, sometimes hair-raising novels about the complexities of family relationships. These works include Clever Girl, Accidents in the Home, The Past, and Everything Will Be All Right. Two of her three short story collections, Sunstroke and Married Love, were New York Times notable books, and her fiction has appeared in The New Yorker since 2002. A creative writing professor at England's Bath Spa University and a regular reviewer for the London Review of Books, Hadley has been longlisted for the Orange Prize and the Wales Book of the Year, and she won the 2016 Wyndham Campbell Prize for Fiction. She joins us today with her latest novel, Free Love, the story of a compliant homemaker's intellectual and sexual awakening in a vibrant 1960s London. NPR calls it a domestic novel of manners, erotic abandon, and cultural exchange. Free Love is as eclectic and alive as the time it captures. Today's author will be in conversation with Jeff Dyer, the author of 4 novels and numerous works of nonfiction. He is writer in residence at the University of Southern California, a fellow of the Royal Society of Literature, and a member of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. His work has been translated into 24 languages, and his many honors include the National Book Critics Circle Award for Criticism, the Somerset Maugham Award, and a Lannan Literary Fellowship. His latest book is called The Last Days of Roger Federer. It's coming out in May, and it's going to be published by FSG. So without further ado, Tessa, Jeff, thank you both so much for being here, and the screen is all yours.
Oh, thank you so much, Jason, and thank you everyone for joining this event. And it's, I'll just say a little sort of something about how Tessa and I met. Time flies, so I think it was probably about 10 years ago, and we were judges on a short story prize. There were 3 of us, the other person being Joe Dunthorne, who wrote that novel Submarine. And there's a long history of prize judging where it's really quarrelsome, and people are saying, over my dead body, you know, he or she won't be shortlisted. But on this occasion, it was very, very different. We agreed on absolutely everything. We arrived at the shortlist so easily that most of the meetings, actually, we pretty much finished discussing and we'd end up just eating sort of pastries for the last 20 minutes of each meeting. So even though it was very, very nice and friendly, still, after a while, I realized that actually Tessa shouldn't have been on the judging panel, because it was so obvious that if instead of being a judge, she'd been a contestant, she would have walked away with the prize. But of course, being a judge, she was ineligible. At that point, I was only, I'd only read her short stories, but since then I've migrated to the novels, which are, well, for me, they're even greater than the short stories. So it's an absolute joy for me to be talking to Tessa Hadley. It's a double joy because in addition to being a really great writer, she's also such a lovely person. So I think we're going to have a great chat.
Lovely to me. We definitely need a gin and tonic to wash that down.
And the nice thing about this, though, actually, is that part of Tessa's character, I think, is that a reluctance to blah on about herself. So the truth is that actually we get today to talk more seriously than we would if we were about her work, than we would if we were just meeting socially. So we're going to talk about this new novel, Free Love, and I think we're going to begin, Tessa, with you doing a reading from it.
That seems the right way to begin. I'll just start from the very opening of the novel, because that's easy. I don't have to give any context. I'll just begin with chapter 1. The first words I wrote and the first words anyone will read. This Friday evening in late summer was so lovely that Phyllis Fisher sat at her dressing table with the window wide open onto the garden. Life flowed into the room from beyond the window in its drowsy suburban evening stream, the steady relieving splash of a hose in a herbaceous border, confiding clack of shears, distant thwack of balls from the tennis club, broken sharp cries of children playing, fragrance of cut grass and roasting meat, jiggling of ice in the first weekend gin and tonics. When slanting low sunlight was suddenly blinding in one wing of the dressing table mirror, Phyllis adjusted it and the light ran instead around the cut glass toiletry set and her bottles of L'air du Temps and witch hazel and cleansing milk. She sat forward in her petticoat, leaning on her elbows to see more clearly in the mirror, feeling the flirting of the breeze on her bare shoulders, smelling the soap on her skin. She was 40, but still had an expectant, animated prettiness. Her sandy tanned face was brushed with faint freckles across the upturned nose. Her rather dry fair hair, not yellow, but a shadowed gold like washed out straw, was back-combed into volume for tonight and stiff with hairspray. She put on pale lipstick carefully, pressing her lips together, frowning at the mirror because she thought that her mouth was too big, too soft and indefinite, as if she might blurt out something coarse or raw. In fact, she was easy, an easy person, easily made happy, glad to make others happy. She was pleased with her life. The year was 1967. Her dress for this evening waited like a friend, hooked on its hanger over the wardrobe door, empire line with a skirt that ended above the knee, green chiffon with bold vertical red and orange stripes, green grogram ribbon sewn under the bust, fastened in a bow in front. She had asked Mandy Veery to press it for her before she went home. No need to keep Mandy on to help serve dinner because it wasn't a formal dinner party. The young man who was coming, Nicholas Knight, might turn out anyway to be a bore. Phyllis had a dim memory that he'd been a bore as a small boy. She'd met him long ago when she was first married to Roger and her daughter Colette was a colicky baby. At 9 or 10 years old, Nicholas had been owlish with a big heavy head and black-framed thick glasses brimming with factual knowledge, insisting that they test him on flags and capitals of the world. Patiently, Roger had obliged. Phyllis's anticipation of Nicholas's visit this evening was only buoyant because she liked entertaining and because he was a man, after all, even if he turned out to be gauche and unattractive. She liked men. She couldn't help herself. Though there was no question of her flirting with Nicholas, who was nearer to the age of her own daughter. Perhaps I'll stop there, setting things up for what's to follow.
Well, several things, Tessa. First of all, I don't think anyone would feel shortchanged if you just continued reading for the next hour. It was just so seductive. I mean, really. And, do you know, I sometimes think that with I mean, I'm here to ask quite a lot of questions, but as you were reading that, I was thinking, there's only one question that I really want to ask. How do you do it? Because it seems to me you've got this knack that you know, there it is, the first page, and we're there completely. And it all seems so effortless. And I was struck by something you said at the beginning, that you were going to read the first lines that you wrote. So is that what you do? Do you really start at the beginning and stop at the end?
I do. I do. Do you know, I do that. Those are the first lines I wrote, and usually, I can't think of an exception. I've forgotten some of my earlier books, but certainly usually those first lines stay. They seem like the first spade marks in the soil of the book. That's a strange image, but that's what came. And they stay. And of course, there's lots of shifting and changing in what follows. But I mean, it is a funny thing, isn't it, to be still in 2022 writing that kind of fiction where at the opening of the book you cross the threshold and I'm pretending to you, to my readers, that this is real, that it's real life, and all of my effort is to make you believe that it's real. And for a long time, when I was struggling to write and not succeeding, I think I was very haunted by that modernist skepticism about realism, about representation. You know, there was, especially in the 70s and 80s, 90s, but maybe it's still there now, I don't know, a great cynicism from a lot of great artists saying, you know, novels, that they're sort of for women and children and servants. They're foolish. There's something foolish about the reader wanting to succumb to that illusion. And it made me uneasy, because on the one hand, I love that as a reader, but I couldn't do it anyway as a writer, so that it took time. But I didn't even know that I should be doing that. I thought perhaps I should be writing novels that announced their novelness and were more sort of less. This is a weird thing to create an illusion, isn't it, in words? What a funny thing one's doing when you do that, when you make a place that smells and looks and appears and has light in it and something happening, and I'm asking you to believe it's there.
But we love that, and as you've so rightly said, Tessa, I mean, what we get here, I mean, as you say, it's the smells, the sounds, everything. It's that thing of complete immersion in another world, and yeah, well, it's got this is going to go very well, because it seems to me that there was, yes, you're absolutely right, there was that objection to the old-fashioned realist novel that was going round at the time. But there was something else going on, I think, really up in the 1970s, up until really maybe the 1980s, when Ian McEwan, Angela Carter and Martin Amis got going and really did kind of give the English novel a real shot in the arm. There was another sort of criticism that was made. It was a real critical commonplace, a cliche actually, and it was that the English novel was just so preoccupied with middle-class adultery. Typically Hampstead was the place where all this adultery was meant to be going on. We'll enlarge the historical context of this shortly, but for now it seems that how interesting, in 2022, there you go, you set this novel up. It's going to be, here we're going to have that exhausted thing, and you're gonna flog what was regarded as this dead suburban horse. So
yeah, I know, that was my other fear, of course, exactly. Not only was I going to write this illusionistic kind of novel, but then it was going to be about mostly middle-class people, not always, and worrying about their feelings and about art and about their relationships. And that, again, I mean, I tried really hard to write one novel about the coal miners' strike. That didn't go well. You're laughing at the very thought.
No,
of course, it was really about people having relationships and falling in love around the coal miners' strike. And then there was another one, which I feel should have been a Booker winner in somebody else's hands, which was about New Caledonia, that French colony. You know, their vote always comes in last in the French election, and they sent all their political exiles there in 1872, whenever it was, after the Commune. And a feminist, Louise Michel, went there and was organizing the uprisings of the indigenous people. What a great novel that would be. Unfortunately, not for me to write. So I was trying not to write. And you're right. Here I am in 2022, and I've just embraced the things I was most afraid of, because it turns out they're home. That you don't get the choice as to which novels you can write, or which books you can write, or what kind of art you can make, do you? You don't get the choice. It's there, and if you're lucky, you find it, and then you embrace it. That's what I've done.
And I mean, one of the reasons I felt so free to sort of summarize your book like that is because, of course, it becomes something very different to the novel of middle-class adultery. And as soon as this the affair begins, I mean, we're aware of Phyllis's doomed antecedents, Emma Bovary and Anna Karenina. Anna Karenina, of course, is mentioned in the book. Yeah. And from a very early stage in those novels, this isn't going to turn out well for these two women, is it? So those novels, which were so influential, they were, as it were, pre-formed, it seems to me, to make a certain moral case. Something very, very different happens here. So perhaps you could say something about, okay, so you've got Phyllis there in that opening scene, but from a very early stage, you knew she wasn't going to stay there, as it were.
Yeah, I did. I mean, actually, it's going to sound complacent, like saying my first sentence really is the first sentence I wrote. This novel, not usually, but this novel did fall into my lap very, very complete. I have the first few pages of the notebook for this novel, kind of has the whole story it's set out in it. So I knew I wouldn't have wanted to write a book that said, here is a misunderstood woman in an awful, false bourgeois world who is going to discover that is more real outside, and she's going to find her other half, her true love. Because I'm actually rather unromantic. I don't think, I love watching somebody who believes that, like Phyllis does for a while at least, but I don't believe that. I like to just watch her, if you like, watch her making that error, but that sounds cruel because I also like her for making it. I'm enjoying her rising to her occasion and being a good old adulteress with all the conviction and wholeness that she brings to it. I'm not sure she's, she's hurting a lot of other people in doing it, but there you are. She carries it off. She does it. And then my plan was always much sneakier, which was that there would be fallout, and that would be interesting to watch her awakening. But it's also interesting to watch, and then what, and then what, and what happens to her daughter, and what happens to her son, and what happens to her husband, and what do we learn retrospectively about her husband, who isn't just a stuffed shirt civil servant, waiting to be betrayed and be boring and be like Karenin in Anna Karenina. He himself identifies himself laughingly as Karenin. He's looking in the mirror to see if his ears are sticking out like Karenins do in Tolstoy. So it's that's what one loves as a novelist, is when you get a story and it has this lovely long fallout that you feel you'll be able to pursue.
Yes, and what happened is that, in a sense, I mean, because of what's well, I mean, let's address this. It's a historical novel, of course. In a way, it's she starts out it starts out as adultery, and then this whole notion of there being such a thing as adultery starts to give way. So right from the start, you knew when and where it was being said.
Yeah, I did. I mean, I think I had actually written a couple of short stories, and one in particular set in the 60s when I was a child. So, this wasn't first. Some of what I've put into the book was firsthand. It's amazing how much you remember as a child, not of the context or the politics of the time exactly, but of the materiality, the smells, the surroundings, the stuff, and what people were saying, which you were sort of interpreting in your confusion as a child. But where was I? Yeah, so I had set this short story called An Abduction in the home counties in the 1960s, the home counties which I knew very little about. That's not my background at all. But I'd sort of relished doing it. I found that the tensions of that time, when the tectonic plates of our cultural life were kind of shifting violently, generated something that was fun and significant to write. That's what you look for, isn't it, in a way, when you want to find a good story or a novel. You look for a place where there's something's moving, and then you look for a person who can embody that Fisher. So I've just called it Fisher, and I get Phyllis Fisher. I have never thought of that before. I don't think that was deliberate. A woman who is going to, in her own life, kind of enact a rupture between an old way of doing things in an old, rather grey, post-war England, hierarchical, deferential. She goes to church club and film club, and then a completely other England, which coexisted with that briefly for a while, the two yet retaining their separate identities, which was, the counterculture. And she moves to pursue her lover to West London, Ladbroke Grove, and Notting Hill at the time, where immigrants from the West Indies, Jewish immigrants, the poor, and the students and the dropouts, and the alternative culture is all fermenting in a sort of heady stew and producing a crazy imagining of possibility, most of which isn't possible, but nonetheless for a moment it's imaginatively possible. And those two worlds sitting side by side, and then I can just have this woman, you know, literally living out the contradiction between them. That was the opportunity that the novel seemed to afford.
Yes, and it's and it's I just I mean, I'm not particularly interested in the Beatles, but I watched that 8-hour Peter Jackson thing, and it's striking, isn't it? When they play that rooftop thing, you realise how much of the England of the 1950s actually lives on to the late 1960s.
Men with rolled umbrellas expostulating at long-haired youth making a noise.
Yes.
And now there are posh men who get indignant and outraged about things. There are probably lots of them, you know, followers of Nigel Farage or Boris Johnson, but they were actually taking drugs in the 1970s. They're fakes in their pompous old Englandness. You know, they actually share the same youth culture with everybody else. So, but they were all, the ones in the Beatles film are authentic. They genuinely come out of a middle-class British culture which thought it was eternal and eternally right.
Yes, but there's also some nice surprises in that Beatles film, whereby some old codger, you know, who you think is going to object to it, says, "Oh yeah, it's quite fun. Nice to have a bit of fun for a change." Yes. Absolutely.
But there were those ridiculous young bobbies with their tall hat, the policeman stopping the music. No, it's very rich. That there's some longers in that documentary.
To put it mildly,
Put it mildly.
Hour or so is amazing. Let's just go back a little bit further in time, from the 1950s to the 1940s, to one of the, the iconic archetypal, almost British almost adulteress, that is to say, Celia Johnson in Brief Encounter. I feel that's such a, there's all sorts of dodges in that film whereby she wants to break out of the, of this thing, but she doesn't. She's saved by the bell, if you remember. And it seems to me that there's several ways in which, Phyllis is just, she's very much like Celia, well, let's say, 20 years down the road.
Yeah, deliberately. Do you know, I've always been mean about Brief Encounter. I don't know why. It's a film I know that I'm not really fair about, because it annoys me so much that they don't have a love affair. I can't approve of them for it. I'm fed up with them. Something Laurentian in me, Jeff.
Oh, right.
Just is outraged with them. And I felt slightly the same about that Hide and Seek, that Elizabeth Taylor novel that I know you've loved so much. I love the book, but I can't quite forgive the decency of that British. So perhaps that's why I've written Free Love and given Phyllis free rein. I do, and I've had an argument with one of my dearest friends, and I think she's actually right, where she says, you don't understand the degree of the prohibition that made it impossible, that made it wrong. And then suddenly in Phyllis's moment, my Phyllis's moment in the 1960s, that whole framework is just lifting off women's shoulders somehow and leaving them free to make mistakes or to follow their instincts, their hunch. And I'm kind of relieved at some release of pressure or something. Something Englishy English that irritates me about Brief Encounter.
Interesting. So you sort of share, actually, quite perhaps not surprisingly, Trevor Howard shared your opinion, probably because he liked the idea of sleeping with Celia Johnson. And he couldn't understand why they were just endlessly drinking tea in the refreshment room at Milford Junction. You've moved on to my next question, which is that, just a bit of background for people. So because of Tessa's recommendation, I've had one of the great reading jags of my life in the last 4 months, reading everything by Elizabeth Taylor. And it seems to me, Tessa, that you seem so obviously the daughter of Elizabeth Taylor, fiction-wise. You can object to that. Yeah, we're not here just to sort of stroke each other. So please object to that if you like. But I feel that the dialogue with Elizabeth Taylor in this book seems so constant. I mean, I've marked several passages where I feel, oh my God, we're actually in, people used to talk about Greenland, this Graham Greene sort of world. And I feel, oh, here we are, where we really are in the same psycho and actual physical geography that we get from.
Yes, it is. It's absolutely her terrain, of course, not my terrain, the home counties, but I think she's born in the home counties, is married there and dies there. It's her terrain, absolutely. Oh, she's just marvelous. When we were talking before, and I was saying how I had felt that distaste for the realist, illusionistic novel for a long time. It had weighed on me, and I think it was the great women writers of the mid-20th century or early to mid-20th century who rescued me from that. It was Elizabeth Taylor and Elizabeth Bowen, and less Jean Rhys, obviously a genius, but more herself, distinctive, slightly marginal terrain, although a sublime writer, and Rumer Godwin, who I'm trying to persuade Jeff to read, and I don't know whether he started her yet.
Not round to that yet.
No. So it was them, and they all. I've sort of got a theory almost that they were women who were so excited to be writing about what they knew, and they were so intelligent and sophisticated in how they did it that they just weren't going to give up the illusionism of the novel. It was fine for men. James Joyce had taken them down that wonderful cul-de-sac of Ulysses, which is but the women weren't going to follow him. They had too many stories to tell from their point of view, from their sort of sideways on look at things. So it was they who rescued me, actually, rather than Ian McEwan, Martin Amis, Angela Carter of my own, the generation just before us. Yeah, they were important to me. And I'm just only honoured by you saying that I remind you of Elizabeth Taylor. That's lovely.
But I just to continue with this for a moment, were you conscious of a sort of dialogue with a game of hide and seek? Because it occurred to me that the daughter in a game of hide and seek, whose name is escaping me now, she's got this intense thing going on at school, and I wondered if you were replicating that.
No, I'd forgotten that, but I wonder if you're right, if I didn't echo it unconsciously. Yes, I think I have remembered that daughter and her relationship with her teacher, and it stayed there as a little shadow play in my mind. I didn't consciously deploy it, but I'm sure you're right. I did think about a game of hide and seek as, a brief encounter type adultery novel of the era just before this book, where suddenly everything's possible.
And obviously the train is such a crucial thing in both those books. Yeah. In fact, in A Game of Hide and Seek, they mention brief encounter, of course. I mean, if you're English, there's really no getting away from it. And I think in a Game of Hide and Seek, one of Harriet's friends says about marriage, it's not just a thing between two individuals. It's a larger societal kind of contract. And the idea is that in Brief Encounter too, that if you start carrying on like this and breaking up the marriage, well, before you know it, the whole society is overthrown, which is what happens in your book. So let's talk a bit more about that, actually. And this gives me great pleasure to say, because there are fewer and fewer chances to say it. But the truth is, you're a little older than me, Tessa. I was born in 1958, so I was, coming up to 10 when this, 9 or 10 when this book starts. But I'm very conscious of how my childhood was sort of, let's say not my childhood, because that was different, but from about the age of 10 onwards, I was really conscious that it was those early teen years were still damped with sort of the the trog oil smell of patchouli and the kind of the damp kind of aftermath of the counterculture with prog rock, all this kind of stuff. And I just wondered if, I mean, and of course now, I mean, we're basically the same age. What the difference does a couple of years make? But back then, those 2 years, they count for they count for so much.
Well, and I can actually remember my dad bringing back Sergeant Pepper, the album. So that's a placing us in time memory. And he was a jazz trumpeter. I mean, he was a school teacher for his day job, but he was a really good jazz trumpeter. So he didn't like pop music that much, but he always liked the Beatles. And I remember that. And I think for my mum and me, it was the Peter Blake cover, that collage of Victoriana was as influential on us as the actual music probably was. It coloured our lives. It was an amazing, what was wonderful about being a child at that time, retrospectively as a novelist, is that we had sitting alongside each other all those different eras. My grandparents' house was at that time unchanged from when they bought it in 1927 when they got married, because in those days you didn't buy new furniture. They took on the furniture of the house and it was still there. Leather armchairs, antimacassars, Gainsborough's Blue Boy print on the wall, a baby grand piano because my nana was a piano teacher. So there was a sort of, you had it laid out for you. There was the brief encounter, grey, mouldy old England, but lots to love nonetheless. And then in my household, there was my mum kind of filling our house with strip pine Victoriana a la Sergeant Pepper. So we had almost a schematic context or a schematic surrounding that taught us history. And I was fascinated by family history. So I kind of knew, my grandfather's baby brothers had died in infancy. I still know their names now. I shouldn't think anybody on earth, well, I know that nobody on earth except me remembers that Percy and Arthur, little twins, died in the 1880s or something. So even at that age, I had a sense of eras passing and replacing one another. And that's always obsessed me, actually. I've always had a sense of time going, and that there's always change and nothing lasts, something like that, which is it's a good place to start being a novelist.
Well, indeed. And, it's one of the things that the BBC is always very good at in their sort of period dramas, that is to say the period details.
Yeah.
But it seems to me there's always a much more difficult thing to get, which is, the Raymond Williams phrase is, the structure of feeling of the time. And was that something that you were sort of able to access by the weird alchemy of the novelist, or to what extent did you need to research it to arrive at that? The period detail is relatively easy to do.
The furnishings are easy, and you're right, the structure of thought and the talk, actually, they're much harder. I mean, I think it was a combination of things. I would be so nervous writing a novel set in the 19th century, to be honest. I can't imagine myself trying to do that. I'm, those rare novelists who do the real past and carry it off astonish me. But I guess I was there, so I was listening. So some of it was that, remembering my parents, remembering parties, my uncle and aunt's house, who did actually live for a while in the home counties. So I had a little bit of that. But I also had, I'm not a great researcher. The idea of sitting down and spending 6 months, like in the British Library, or even more tediously on the internet, researching the 1960s fills me with horror. It's much more like, the day you need it, quickly look something up, or have a wonderful book like Jonathan Green's compendium, published in the 1980s. I reference it in the acknowledgements because it was so precious to me, where he talked to lots of ex-hippies who were all there in West London. And of course, they were all talking the talk. And that's those are the little treasures when you're writing a book, when somebody uses a phrase that would no one would use in 2022, but in 1980 something, but remembering 67, you know, if only we all dropped acid together, if all the governments of the world dropped acid together, there would be world peace. And people really did say extraordinary things like that, that you can't quite believe how, as it were, archetypally 1960s some of the language was. So that was so valuably suggestive. Yeah. And some photographs online. And I read lovely books like Margaret Drabble's The Millstone, which were really valuable for things like what when you got pregnant, then what happened? How did you know? Where where did you go to antenatal classes? Were there such things as all the little details like that I stole from here or there.
And just a few, the questions are starting to come in, but we'll just talk for a little bit more, Tessa, before we move on to those. You know, it's, yeah, so she leaves her, I don't think this is a spoiler to say she leaves her home county's life. And of course, it's an incredible disruption for everybody. But I mean, if you think there is, and she embraces, yeah, she embraces the counterculture. I think one of the rather clever things is that the love interest, he is actually rather cynical about some of the more ridiculous aspects of of the time. But I don't want to get too into that because we might spoil some of the pleasures to come. But it seems to me, I mean, given what she does, and given, if you think of Joan Didion's reportage from San Francisco during the kind of summer of love, and she sees very quickly that, oh, this is just gonna end in chaos, and you can't be giving acid to a kind of 10-year-old or whatever. So you know, at various points in the book, some fairly sort of risky things happen, but actually it turns out to be it's not, we're not giving anything away by saying this book is not a, I'm not giving anything away if I say this isn't a tragedy and it doesn't all end in.
No.
She doesn't do.
I think that's one of the things that happens to the novel of adultery in the 20th century is it can't any longer be a tragedy. It would be absurd to say that a woman leaving her marriage is tragic, as it was for Emma Bovary and Anna Karenina and all those who sailed in her, so to speak. And no, it's not. It's a sort of, I mean, a comedy, but not broad comedy for laughs. But it's a human comedy, and we watch Phyllis. Is she unraveling? That's what I liked about writing Phyllis, and this doesn't mean exactly, it wasn't identifying with her, and it wasn't seeing that what she does is a great heroic opening that is to be admired. It was watching her and then somewhere believing that something real does change for her. And all right, there's a sexual awakening. It has been a rather passionless marriage, and that's good. I'm glad she got that. But even more than that, there's the one night when she sits after they've made love, and she sits on Nicky's chair in his rather bare room in this sort of crazy place where he's lodging, and he falls asleep, and he's given her a bit of small change of lefty politics of the time. You know, it's the West what did it, and you know, we're responsible for all it. You know, it all turns out to be mostly true. We're responsible for all evils, and colonialism is repulsive, and dignified men in suits actually order bombings of women and children, and innocently Phyllis has never thought any of this before. For Nicky, it's just everyday chit chat. You know, it's taken for granted. I don't even mean to diminish him, but it's taken for granted. And she sits up, it's a sort of vigil, and she sits there and she takes it in, and it's to her credit. I want it to be to her credit that quest inside her conscience, where for the first time she pursues certain paths that she's evaded, and she stops trusting the men on the news who tell her everything will be all right and all is for the best in the best of all possible worlds. And she pushes past them and thinks large, terrible thoughts about the way the world is ordered. And I really mean that to have changed her. And again, I'm not giving away too much. At the end of the book, there's a conversation between her and her husband. It's an amiable, it's not a horrible conversation. And he's offering her to come home if she wants to. And she says, I can't come back to that. Every cell in my body is changed. And I sort of want us to look at her and think two things at once. And one of them is, you know, really? You're just living a boho life in West London. So what's changed? But at the same time, we should believe her, because actually those transformations are not nothing. They're not nothing. And it's true that something in her is changed, and maybe it doesn't have consequences. I don't know. Maybe the only consequence is in her and her perspective and how she is in the world. Maybe that's all it is, but it's not nothing. And the story is partly about that.
Yeah, it has a potentially liberating effect, not just on her, but on the husband and certainly on the daughter, doesn't it?
Yeah, it does. It does. It does. Yeah.
And all of this is, you're such a novelist, Tessa. So it's all just, so for example, just on page 2, we get that you read this bit. There she is getting ready for this party. Her hair, getting into volume for tonight, her hair stiff with hairspray. So there we have it. I mean, already.
Yeah, I can remember my mum doing that, of course. Back combing, that's the most horrible thing, where you pull your hair up and then you brush the hair down. It's horrible, but everyone did it. Do you know what was really interesting when I was reading that? There's that bit where I said, Phyllis Fisher, what do I say? Phyllis Fisher was 40, but still had an animated, expectant prettiness. And my editor now, last year, said, surely it's not but, it's and. Because now a woman of 40, no one's thinking, well, she's past it, because, 60 is the new 40 or something like that. Anyway, but then it was 40 then. I remember my mother being absolutely neurotic about turning 40, because 40 was a terrible watershed between youth and being past it.
Yeah, and she becomes a lot younger, partly because she's, for example, she leaves off, she doesn't need the hairspray. And then on page 93, of course, we get this other character. Nowadays, this is somebody else. Nowadays, her unruly hair had been permed into extinction. Yes. Oh my God, it's so great. And just before we hand over, Tessa, it just seems to me that always reading you, irrespective of what the story is or whatever, there are enough incidental pleasures that that I like. So, for example, the relationship with Phyllis and her housekeeper Mandy, where she's talking to her something like the slight impatience of someone in charge. Oh, this is wonderful stuff. Anyway, we've been yattering on, Tessa, and the stuff is starting to, we're getting the message. Let's just read this. It's not a question, but it's good to have it, because this is not a question, but a note of adoration. Tessa Hadley, you've accompanied me through many stages of womanhood, motherhood, middle age, and loss. I feel so lucky that I found your books when I did. I feel known in ways no one else in my world, except my best girlfriends, knows me. Thank you for your work, for your curious mind, for your unflinching truth-telling.
Wow.
Here is a question, though, from Lillian Battle. How do you manage to get the tone right in each of your books, particularly when you're looking to the past, even when you've lived it?
It's not hard, as in you're not struggling for it in each sentence, but it's actually when you're writing the first pages of the novel, that's when you have to get the tone right, because that will hopefully sustain you through the rest. And these are all intuitive judgments, just that horrible judgment when you sit down to your computer and you look at what you've done so far and you think, oh no, it's wrong, it doesn't feel right, I'm being too shouty, or I've lost control is another thing that can happen as you're writing, actually, where you stop managing what you're putting on the page, and you just sort of let the story tell itself. That was a great discovery for me when the books got better and stopped writing the coal strike books and wrote better books. It was actually control. It was, you're in charge here, take control. What do you want to do with this scene? So there's all of that, but at the same time, not too much control. So I don't know how it's done, and it's an ongoing negotiation as one writes.
Okay, thank you. Just a word to the audience. Some of you who've asked questions, I'm going to not ask them, because I hope you agree that we've actually, I'm addressing the audience now, because I hope you agree that we've incidentally covered these. But well, I'll read out Deborah Moffat's question. As a long-time novelist, have you noticed any changes in readers over the years? And what is the state of the reader today? And a thank you for mentioning Heinrich Boll's story In Search of the Reader in a previous podcast. I love it.
Yes, it's a great story.
So,
yeah. Of course, I don't know, because readers are invisible. I mean, they're not entirely invisible, and some of them come to events like this and ask lovely questions. But I was talking to the people at Daunt's bookshop in Marylebone High Street the other week, where I had my launch, and I went in and signed some books the next day. Now, they said they think fewer young men, which upsets me. Fewer young men reading fiction. Young men are more of them. This is, and quite recent, they say, that there was a surge of young men reading fiction and that it's gone and that they're now reading non-fiction. I have no explanation for that. I don't know. It's mysterious. I mean, people have been talking about the death of the novel as we did for a long time, and it seems it's just such a delicious form in the end, that it seems to survive and thrive in Britain, and I think this is true in North America. Women have been the mainstay as readers of fiction. But somehow I'm always very proud when a man likes my book. That's such an unfeminist thing to say, isn't it? But it's like I've conquered the difficult reader when someone like Jeff likes my books.
Oh, okay.
It doesn't count for two. That really and truly isn't what I think. But I used to worry that I was writing for a very female audience, and so it's very nice when nice young men, really nice looking young men, just queue up in the signing queue, and then they would give me the book and they'd say, "My mum loves your books." I'm sure that never happened to you, Jeff.
Oh, it does actually. But here's an interesting question, because, well, I won't give anything away, but the ending of this book is very, very interesting and unexpected. It doesn't end where you thought it would, but Natalie Serber asks you at the end of the story, one Saturday morning, you bring the characters together to stare closely at a bug, to revel in its mystery, and the moment opens the story out into wonder. How do you know when you've landed at the right ending? Very good question, I think.
Yeah, it's very different in a short story and a novel. And the ending is far more potent in a short story, because actually a reader of a short story is holding on all the way through to see what they think it is until they get to the end. It's sort of explanatory in a way that you couldn't possibly hang a whole novel. I suppose you can if it's a Agatha Christie. You are hanging the whole novel on what happens at the end. But most novels, they have to deliver other satisfactions and fulfillments and rest points along the way. So I mean, I'm scared writing a short story if I don't know when I start something about where I'm going to bring it down, though that can change as you're writing. You think of something better. With a novel, I knew with this one, it was this whole thing of the whole book coming to me in one package. I knew exactly where, not exactly, because when you have notes, you have like a map. And then when you're writing the book, suddenly you're not in a map, you're in a landscape. So of course I didn't know exactly. I didn't know what it was going to feel like, but I knew that I was going to end with the two characters I do in Free Love, and I knew where I was going to end. Isn't that amazing? I don't know what that stuff is, where it's delivered to you, but that hasn't. The one I'm starting now, I'm so at sea, and I'm terrified that I don't know what I'm going to do with it at the end. So it doesn't always come so neatly.
Let's go back to the beginning. Did you have the all-important plot twist in your head right at the beginning?
Yeah. Isn't it amazing? I even think I might have almost started with that, Jeff. Sometimes when I'm looking for a story, I look to the classic myths and so on, just idly thinking, that any good? And I was thinking of Phaedra, who falls in love with her stepson. And I was thinking, oh, that's a good story. Whoops, I've slightly. For anybody really smart, good at puzzles, they can now work out what that plot twist is.
Yeah. Okay. Well,
Anyway.
we'll try to move on from that. I'm just having a look at what's going on in the chats here. Okay. We could This is quite niche. This question: did the characters marry the wrong people in the book The Past?
In the book The Past, well, there's certainly some. I mean, Roland, there's 4 siblings in that book, 3 sisters and a brother, and he's on his 3rd marriage, so obviously he thinks he married the wrong people the first 2 times round, and he's pretty satisfied with the very glamorous Argentinian he's married to this time. But I think his sisters don't agree, so who gets to decide? And yeah, that Fran is in one of those complicated marriages to a no good man that she's nonetheless attracted to and can't quite leave alone. So yeah, actually it's not a very marriagey book. It's one of my least marriagey books. Marriage is not big in it, really, I think. In the middle section, which it's a moment when I go back to the 1960s. Yes. Then that is about a marriage, and who knows? Yeah, maybe. Nay, who can decide those things? Some ultimate doomsday judge is sitting there, and he will hand out the verdict on this marriage was the good idea, this was the bad one. But until that doomsday, we don't know.
Well, it's funny you end on that note of uncertainty, and it's funny. I mean, I'm going to start summing things up now. So I'm here to sort of help boost your sales, but I'll just say to our audience that this book contains one of my favorite ever descriptions of a penis, which I'm going to share with the audience. He was taking off his trousers, hopping on one foot, peeling off his socks, his penis still buoyant and slick from their lovemaking. Oh, that is so
You've embarrassed me.
Buoyant and slick. That is, I mean, I'm really, it's something I'm absolutely convinced of now. You can tell a great writer just from the tiniest things, and
that tiny penis.
Yeah, it's so fantastic. But at the same time, you can tell great writing from the smallest thing. At the same time, it's very mysterious. So I come back to my first question, my opening question, which has not been answered because it's unanswerable. And the question is, how do you do it? And of course, in a sense, you don't know how you do it. And the only way to find out how you do it is actually to read the book, it turns out. I think I bring this to an end now, don't I? And so thank you everyone for attending. Thank you, Tessa, for being so generous as always. And
what a lovely chat. Thank you so much.
Really enjoyed it. And Jason, I think, isn't going to say anything else, but you all know how to buy the book. And I guess so. Thank you, everyone. And
farewell across the Atlantic.
Yes.
It's grown dark in Wales while we were talking.
All over Wales, the lights are going out. Great. Okay, so thank you, everyone. And I believe that's it now.
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you, Tessa. Okay, bye-bye.
Thanks, Jeff. Thank you.
Bye-bye.